music can be something that's really emotionally evocative. It can be something that provides this solidarity. It can sustain momentum, even when under an authoritarian regime, you don't have a lot of places for open protest. It can include perhaps hidden meanings. Opposition has opportunities for these kind of small, perhaps hidden forms of contestation by using different forms of popular culture that they can use, again, to kind of sustain momentum and opposition and let others know that they're not alone, that I also am frustrated with the regimes.
Welcome to Pop and Politics, your guide to art and culture in Turkey. I'm your host, Kenan Behzat Sharpe. Each week, we host an artist, musician, director, writer, actor, or other creative worker in Turkey. This week, we're doing something slightly different. We're joined by Lisel Hintz. She is the Assistant Professor of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. Hintz studies issues of identity politics, authoritarian consolidation, and the politics of resistance, and particularly how these intersect with popular culture and other forms of media. Her 2018 book from Oxford University Press, Identity Politics Inside Out, National Identity Consultation and Foreign Policy in Turkey, examines how Turkey's Justice and Development Party used foreign policy gambits to weaken its domestic obstacles and open up space for disseminating its own Ottoman Islamist understanding of the Turkish national identity. Her current book project, under contract with Cambridge University Press, examines state society struggles over identity in Turkey through the lens of popular culture. Lisel, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's a real pleasure for me too. And I have to say that, the first time we met in person was when you organized this really great panel in 2019 for the Middle East Institute. And that was about art in the time of authoritarianism. And that was actually the first time I met you, the first time I met our very own Rushan Çakır here. And it was also the first time I met Shanishar, the rapper, who later became a guest on this show. So in a way, that meeting and that conference was really sowed the seeds for this show.
Fantastic. Coincidentally, I gave a presentation in Italian class yesterday in Italian on teaching political themes through cultural materials, and I included a picture of that very panel of age at the time of the piece. And so very glad our paths crossed there.
Absolutely. So I want to ask about an article you wrote, because I think it'll really interest viewers of this show, and it's about pop culture as an everyday form of resistance against authoritarianism here in Turkey. So a lot of your work touches on these themes, which is why I wanted to speak to you. And I'm curious how you see this relationship between pop culture and politics in Turkey. And when you talk about pop culture, what kind of things are you talking about? And then how do these things function as resistance?
Yeah, so that article, is interesting. That article was my first foray into kind of looking at these identity struggles that I had studied in the foreign policy arena in the book through the lens of popular culture. And since then, I thought it was maybe going to be a one-off, but I've really dived, I think, headfirst into studying politics through culture. And now that article is part of this larger book project. So when we're talking about how politics and popular culture intersect, the way that I think about that in the book and think about how we can organize those kinds of discussions and understanding the relationship is I have a chapter on how popular culture is part of foreign policy and how the AKP, for example, tried to use its television shows as a form of soft power to create markets, to create affinities, to create tourism with populations largely in the Middle East, also in the Balkans, but also how television and other forms of popular culture can become kind of these sites of contestation. So if you look at the GCC crisis and Turkey's relationship with Qatar at the time, which Turkey was supporting when the GCC had placed an embargo on Qatar.
Can you remind our viewers what the GCC is real quick?
Absolutely. So the Gulf Cooperation Council, organization of states in the Gulf, and they had placed an embargo on Qatar because of Qatar's support of Hamas. And Turkey was supporting, which also supports Hamas, was supporting Qatar during that time. And so, sort of as a punishment for that, Saudi and UAE decided to sort of sanction Turkish television programming. So Saudi Arabia pulls all of its Turkish television content from the airwaves, which was actually really difficult for channel directors because a lot of television content was Turkish television content, and it was immensely popular, and viewers were like, give us back, Gümüş, give us back Fatma Gül'ün Suçu Ne, right? So there was a really geopolitical component to the way in which these television shows function. When Turkey sort of had a rupture with Egypt, there had also been a large export of Turkish television shows to Egypt, and following the Arab Spring, there was a warming of relations because you had kind of ideologically similar parties. And then you had the coup in Egypt that ousted a Muslim Brotherhood party. And Egypt also cut its television programming. So popular culture is a really fundamental form of politics and form of trying to spread power, but also contest power. So that's one way we can think about the relationship. I also have a chapter and another article that we can talk about later on cooking shows and gender norms, but how regimes like governments can kind of police and patrol the kinds of identities that show up on television. And that may not seem super important, but if you think about regulations against, the use of a particular language, right? So in the past, there have been bans on Kurdish language in television broadcasting. There's not a formal ban, but you've since seen a lot of policing of Kurdish concerts, right? Of other forms of Kurdish cultural production by the ruling party and its nationalist MHP alliance partner. You've seen, the government using the language of family values to justify the exclusion of LGBTQ characters on television. Or you can think of Huysuz Virgin, right? The grumpy virgin, who had been so popular on television, but was sanctioned. So the government can use its tools, both the formal institutional tools of, say, the Supreme Board of Radio and Television, but also the political economy of the media. That means that these, major holding companies that have construction ties and banking ties and mining ties to the government are showing pro-AKP television content, both in the news and in terms of popular culture, in order to facilitate those business transactions. So then there's the regime component. And then there's the opposition component, which is what that article was about, and how opposition using perhaps other forms of popular culture. So the question of sort of what is popular culture is really important, and it has access to production, right? So pretty much anyone can make a YouTube video or could, make some graffiti and put it on a wall or on a pavement. It's more difficult to produce a film and to get the rights and the licensing to do so. And we've seen, as I've contributed to an article that you wrote about how the government can provide funding for a film or a television show, and then perhaps sanction that film or that television show later on because perhaps of the inclusion of a gay narrative.
Are you talking there about Emin Alper's Burning Days film, right?
I am indeed, yes. And we also saw Kasım Öz, who's a Kurdish filmmaker who had produced a film with funding from the Turkish Culture Ministry, later be on trial for the production of his films. So really, again, that intersection of culture and politics is important. But for the opposition, things like music production, so songs, rap songs, which is where our intersection with Shana Sher came into place. That article talks about the ways in which music can be something that's really emotionally evocative. It can be something that provides solidarity. It can sustain momentum, even when under an authoritarian regime, you don't have a lot of places for open protest. It can include perhaps hidden meanings. So you and I have written a piece on Targan's Gerçek, which perhaps is about the pandemic ending. Perhaps it's about other political situations ending. So opposition has opportunities for these kind of small, perhaps hidden forms of contestation by using different forms of popular culture that they can use, again, to kind of sustain momentum and opposition and let others know that they're not alone, that I also am frustrated with the regime. So, there's can be sort of community building aspect to it as well.
Definitely. And I want to ask you about the concept of identity. So you touched on this a little bit, but I know the book you're working on now talks about these state society struggles over identity, again, through pop culture. And I'm curious if you have an example of how that works or what you're thinking when you talk about identity there.
Yeah, so I talk about this mostly in kind of the regime chapter of using television as a social engineering tool, as a way of, again, policing and promoting the kinds of identities we want to see on television. So again, what language is used? Are people consuming alcohol? We know that has been banned on Turkish television. And I have, again, this project on cooking shows, which is really fascinating because you have all of these people in these competition cooking shows like Yemekteyiz with these really elegant stemware, wine glasses that remain empty on the table. So it's like, look at how nice a tablescape I can provide, and I'm a very good host. But yet, of course, we can't have alcohol. So I'm going to use these wine glasses, and they're either going to stay empty or I'm going to pour like ayran into them. Right?
It's funny because that little detail gives you a whole bunch about identity, about lifestyle, about religion, about class. It's really interesting.
It really does. I have to tell you, that particular detail was the hook for this entire paper on cooking shows. I just saw that and I was fascinated. And I've been watching cooking shows in Turkey obsessively since 2012, 2013, when I first started learning Turkish and doing research. And it's amazing how many different components of identity are present in food shows, right? It's about regional cuisine. It's about holidays. It's about Ramadan. So it's about religion, right? And so they'll talk about, this is how we celebrate. Well, not everybody in Turkey celebrates Ramadan. So there's a sort of us and them component that is part of these cooking shows, which you think of as like these, everyday programs, maybe for fun, maybe you learn a little bit. But they really can contain these narratives of what's socially acceptable and how we should behave. So you see, again, language, religion, food, gender, sexuality. What does it mean to be a good Turkish citizen? Which holidays do we celebrate? What role does the military play? Like this, all of these questions are actually present in the kinds of television programming that we consume. And again, if we're thinking about what's showing up on television, you have to think about this really deeply integrated role that the ruling party has with private media, not just state media, but private media as well. So we've seen, for example, the ban on Türkishdizi, right?
Which tell us a little bit about that, to how that controversy started.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of those occasions when a television show kind of becomes a topic of conversation on Twitter. So the idea is that I think the show is kind of problematizing these binary understandings of secular and Islamist and modern and conservative or traditional, and I think the audience is starting to empathize with headscarf characters in ways that they might not have previously, and it's only relatively recently that we started to see headscarf characters. And so one particular character kind of became the topic of conversation on Twitter, like, well, who's she going to vote for, right? And if she votes for this party, then that means that. Or so I think these characters can become focal points of political debates in really, really interesting ways. So the show was sanctioned by the Supreme Board of Radio and Television. It was given, I think, a 5-week ban. Ostensibly for containing scenes of violence against women, which one would think, if you are someone who supports causes that are pro-feminist or are progressive when it comes to women's rights, that sounds like something good. But in fact, given kind of the party's history with legislation and implementation of legislation when it comes to violence against women, it seems as though this was more of a political jab than it was an actual let's ban violence against women. I think the those in the public who are seeing this ban are aware of the fact that this is not about, let's, not show violence against women, but rather this is more of a punishment of a show that has become a topic of debate amongst the opposition. What's really fascinating, and because of the Turkish television production process, you can respond. You can, in your television show, which you produce super quickly, you can respond to current events. And so in the show Aile, relatively soon after that, you see a super quick reference saying, oh, we got to go. Look, the Kızılcık Şerbeti is on. We've got to go and watch it, right? So that's a show of solidarity and support with this other program that had been sanctioned by the government. So there's all kinds of different ways in which identity is coming up. These programs can talk to each other. But I think it really highlights how incredibly political popular culture is.
Absolutely. I mean, you've given all these examples of how it's connected to foreign policy, to the economy, to opposition politics, all these things. It's really so deeply intertwined. So I want to ask you, of course, Turkey's heading towards really historic elections on May 14th now. And I know you've been tracking how both the ruling parties and the oppositions have been using social media. And you and I have an ongoing project about this where we've identified something we call boomer fails, where these, older establishment politicians try to reach out to the youth, and sometimes it doesn't go the way they expect, or can be sort of cringe, as we say. So I'm curious to hear from you how you see how these two campaigns have been using social media, especially when it comes to trying to woo the youth vote, which we know is going to be really important in this election.
Absolutely. I don't think we can underscore this enough. There's going to be 7 million people who are voting for the first time in Turkey, 7 million youth who have grown up knowing nothing but the AKP, knowing nothing but Erdogan. And a lot of those youth, are concerned about things like unemployment and inflation and, access to university education. And even if I have an education, where do I go with that? They're concerned about climate change. And I think what we find in our project is that a lot of these political elites and their, well-funded, communications teams aren't necessarily taking youth, or weren't necessarily taking youth seriously. And we're sort of pandering to them, as you and I talk about, using social media, using government or party-produced rap videos as opposed to independent artist-produced music videos, some Spotify lists, things like that, TikTok videos, that weren't really addressing the very serious, tangible concerns of the youth. And I think we've seen a little bit of a shift in that, at least in the opposition party. And I would say that with the opposition coalition, the E Party, I think, and Meral Akşener were perhaps a little bit more skilled than, say, the Republican People's Party in kind of the wit that was used and the messaging. But overall, again, I think that there was a lack of really, let's focus on substantive issues. And I think that, especially following the earthquakes, we've seen the parties in the opposition coalition sort of take their opportunity to try to put aside some of the identity politics, the divisiveness that I think the ruling party is trying to stoke, and kind of focus on much clearer, much more tangible messaging. If you can't afford beyaz peynir, here's why. Here's the person to blame. It's the AKP, right? So this sense that there's a taking seriously of the economic and job prospect and education and climate concerns of the youth. So I think we're seeing a slightly better campaign strategy from the parties in the opposition. I will say, and people have really debated this, but I think that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's messaging on social media has become really effective. And I think one of the reasons is that he's recognized that he's not a firebrand like Erdogan. He can use very kind of calm, concise, genuine messaging, and that comes across in a couple of ways on social media and the YouTube videos that he's been producing. I think the fact that his kitchen and his air fryer have become the topic of social media, fascination is evidence of this, right? People are making their own Zoom backgrounds in Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's kitchen because they're kind of fascinated by it, and they're not reacting as negatively as they did to some of the other messaging that was coming from the Republican People's Party. I also think that the videos about being Kurdish identity and specifically about Alevi identity, really, I think this is my opinion. I've heard others say this, but from someone who studies identity politics and has studied Alevism and Kurdism and these other marginalized, stigmatized identities in Turkey for a long time, I think that was an incredibly on-point messaging video, whether it was done solely for electoral purposes, whether it was to kind of try to shoot down the AKP's ability to use Kılıçdaroğlu's Aleviness against him, or whether it was part of a bigger strategy of we're unified, you don't get to kind of cut us down, we're going to come together. I think it represented a really big and significant change. Following people on social media who were like, I'm Alevi, and for the first time, like I hear this talked about openly. I think that had a really big impact. So again, I don't think we should underestimate the role that these kinds of videos and social media platforms and campaigns can have, not only in the electoral process, but also in the ways in which these issues are discussed and how people feel as members of those communities.
Absolutely, yeah. It's been really interesting to track. And, people were saying that the opposition was really weak on TikTok and they've really stepped up their game now there. And there's a lot of sort of cute videos, lots of hearts, which has become one of the symbols of the opposition with that inclusive messaging. So it's all been really fascinating. I wanted to follow up about your cooking show project. Is there anything else you'd like to add or tell us about that? Because it's really fascinating.
Thanks. Yeah. So there's a number of people who've been, I think, working on, Turkish television shows in foreign policy, but there's also those people who are focusing on kind of the ways in which they either reflect or are meant to shape how people think about identity in Turkey. And so this particular show in the lines of work like Greek scholars such as Feda Sayan Cengiz, is looking at reality competition shows and at these sort of what I call studio shows where you have a host like Nursel Ergin, right, who's doing, different kinds of shows from a studio kitchen, and how they are conveying particular senses of who is the correct woman in Turkey, who's the ideal woman. And what's really fascinating in tracking the messaging that comes through, for example, in the studio shows, the competition shows are kind of like this us versus them polarizing dynamic. Often the pious headscarfed woman is the one who is winning, and the kind of tattooed tank top wearing dyed hair woman is aggressive and she doesn't win. And then you have all these comments, not in the YouTube comment section, not on the cooking, but rather on the character of the individual, which I think is quite interesting. But in the studio shows, there's this really interesting kind of educational opportunity, because you're teaching tips about cooking for your family, right? But you're also teaching about how to make your mother-in-law happy, and how to make sure your husband's happy, and how to make sure you provide a good iftar dinner, and how to raise your children. So there's all of these norms about how a particular woman should behave in Turkey that adhere very, very closely to the neoconservatism of the AKP, to its kind of biopolitical agenda, whereby women take care of the home, they take care of the family, they take care of the extended family. They have at least 3 children. They observe, they're pious Muslims. They raise their children as pious Muslims. So while these, hosts are kind of giving tips about how to make the best baklava, they're also sharing tips that adhere to, and I argue promote, sort of the idea about the AKP's idealized womanhood.
Last of all, I wanted to ask you about a different project you're working on. So since the terribly destructive earthquakes in February in Turkey and Syria, you've been working with scholars, both graduate students and young scholars who are struggling to do their academic writing in this really difficult period. And you've been having these writing sessions with them, trying to help them focus and expand their work. So I'm curious what this project has been like, where the idea came from, and what the response has been to these Zoom writing sessions with survivors of the earthquake.
Yeah, I really appreciate you giving me a little bit of space to talk about this. I use social media as a way to get this message out. But one of the things that happened in the wake of the earthquakes, and I'm not from Turkey, but most of my social and professional and intellectual circles are deeply, deeply rooted in Turkey. And following the earthquakes, I was sort of watching on social media what people were looking for. And a lot of people were looking for community. A lot of people from Turkey in the diaspora were like, I'm here in California doing my PhD, and everybody around me is going about their daily life, and I'm hurting and I'm angry and I'm really frustrated at the politics that made this disaster so much worse than it needed to be. And I'm really struggling with my writing, and I don't know if I can get things done. And, as someone who, struggles with deadlines anyway, to think about how incredibly difficult it must be to be distracted, to be worried about family, to be in grief, to be in frustration and anger, and then to be facing a deadline to your dissertation committee. So I thought, okay, I'm going to use this technique that I've seen others use, which is create, a 2-hour space where you join the Zoom group, you turn off social media and email, and you sort of write a sentence to the group in the chat about the project you want to work on that day. And that kind of helps you focus just on that project. It also helps find points of common interest across the group members. So we've had a couple of connections that I've made on people working on populism and religion, on people working on sectarianism, and we're creating chats for them as well. So it's a space for focus, for community. It may seem a little strange to be working silently with all these people on your screen, but every once in a while you look up and you see others are still writing, and you kind of keep going. And it's been incredibly, the first time that I started the session and people started to log on, I started to cry because I didn't know, is this stupid? Is anybody going to be interested in this? And we've had over 80 people participate. People come at different times. Some people come for the morning and the evening session. Some people come once a week. So if people are interested, please reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to add you to the group. But I think it's been a productive space. We had one person finally submitted their PhD dissertation, and he's defending today. So fingers crossed for him. But yeah, it's been productive for a lot of people. So I'll keep it going as long as people need a space to focus on writing.
That's really great. Yeah, that's inspiring. And if people want to join, they can, of course, find you on Twitter and contact you through there. Wonderful.
Yep.
Well,
and again, I really appreciate you giving me the space to talk about it. Thank you.
Definitely. It's been really interesting to hear about this project, and I wanted to hear more about it. So that's our time for today. But Lisel, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. It is always a pleasure. It's a pleasure to work with you. It's a pleasure to write with you, and keep doing what you're doing, because this is a fantastic platform.
Thanks so much.